There is a quiet permission many people arrive at without deciding to. The sense that pushing no longer feels noble, that striving feels oddly outdated, that rest has appeared without being earned. Nothing dramatic has happened. There is no collapse, no breakdown, no obvious reason to stop. And yet continuing feels wrong, as if effort itself has lost its justification. This kind of rest doesn't feel like recovery or relief. It doesn't feel comforting. It feels final, unfamiliar, slightly disorienting, as though something has ended without asking for acknowledgement. We are taught that rest exists to prepare us for more work. That stopping only makes sense if it leads back to movement. But sometimes rest appears because the work has already finished its psychological task. Not because you failed, not because you gave up, but because something inside you no longer needs to be pushed forward. When the psyche tells you to rest, it's rarely asking for a pause. It's signaling completion. To understand this state, guilt and urgency have to be removed first. Jung viewed the psyche as self-regulating and economical. Energy is not moral. It is not a reward for discipline or a punishment for weakness. It is allocated where adaptation is required. When adaptation completes, libido withdraws. Rest in this sense is not laziness. It is the absence of psychic demand. The shock people associate with what comes next does not come from sudden change, but from how quietly the psyche prepares for it. Jung observed that major inner reorganizations do not arrive with excitement or inspiration. They begin with disengagement. De ego mis reactis. It assumes rest is recovery before more striving, a temporary dip before ambition returns. But the psyche uses rest as a clearing mechanism, removing attachment, ambition, and emotional noise so something structurally different can emerge. This creates tension. De ego wants momentum, reassurance, and direction. De psyche wants accuracy. What follows will feel shocking only because it does not negotiate with effort or desire. The next segments will show why rest appears before psychological change, why it feels empty instead of hopeful, why forcing activity disrupts the process, and why what follows surprises only the part of you that still expects movement to look like effort. As this disengagement settles in, rest begins to arrive in a way that feels nothing like what you were taught to expect. You may notice that you can stop without resistance, yet stopping does not bring relief. Sleep happens, but it does not restore ambition. Breaks are taken, but desire does not return sharpened or renewed. Even doing nothing feels strangely neutral, as though pleasure and dissatisfaction have both stepped back at the same time. This is unsettling precisely because rest is culturally framed as healing, as recovery, as the moment where energy rushes back in and motivation reappears. When that doesn't happen, the ego assumes something is wrong. But psychologically, this kind of rest signals something very specific. In Jungian terms, when a psychological orientation completes its function, the psyche does not immediately replace it with another. It first withdraws libido. Energy pulls back from the structures, identities, and goals that once demanded constant investment. This withdrawal creates a stillness that feels flat rather than soothing. Relief belongs to resolution, to stories that end with understanding or reward. This rest belongs to disengagement. It marks the end of participation, not the beginning of recovery. The ego struggles here because it expects rest to feel earned and rewarding as proof that effort was worthwhile. When rest arrives without comfort, the ego interprets it as emptiness, laziness, or failure. The shadow amplifies this fear, whispering that rest without relief means nothing will return, that detachment equals loss. But what is actually happening is simpler and more precise. You are not resting in order to go back. You are resting because something no longer requires you. The psyche is not preparing you for another cycle of striving. It is closing a loop. This is why the rest feels emotionally neutral. There is no excitement because there is no new investment yet. There is no comfort because comfort implies continuation. What you are experiencing is the pause between withdrawal and reinvestment. A phase where the psyche has finished asking something of you but has not yet asked something else. If this resonates, it is not because you are failing to recover. it is because you are no longer attached to what once demanded your energy. This rest is not healing you. It is releasing you. From this neutral rest, another shift quietly follows. Desire itself begins to fall silent. You may notice that future thinking loses its charge. Goals that once pulled you forward now register as distant ideas rather than invitations. Fantasies about what could happen feel abstract, oddly irrelevant. Even fear about what might go wrong softens, not because reassurance has arrived, but because projection itself is weakening. You remain functional, present, capable of daily action. Yet inwardly there is a spacious quiet where wanting used to live. This state confuses the ego because desire has long been mistaken for vitality. In Jungian terms, however, desire is not proof of life. It is fuel for adaptation. It emerges when the psyche needs to move towards something not yet integrated. When that adaptive task completes, desire dissolves. The psyche stops reaching forward and begins consolidating inwardly. This is why the silence feels clean rather than heavy. There is no weight pressing down, no despair dragging you backward. There is simply an absence of pull. That distinction matters. Depression is saturated with affect with self-reproach with psychic gravity. This state is marked by neutrality. The ego panics here, interpreting the vanishing of desire as danger, as stagnation, as the loss of ambition or purpose. The shadow deepens the alarm, equating wanting with aliveness and imagining that without desire, nothing meaningful can occur. But psychologically, this silence signals preparation. When nothing calls you forward, it is often because the psyche is reorganizing at a level too structural to be imagined, desired, or planned. Desire belongs to known trajectories. What is forming now does not yet have a shape the ego can pursue. The psyche withdraws projection so it can realign orientation. This is why forcing goals feels hollow and why old dreams no longer entice. The absence of desire is not a void to be filled. It is a clearing in which a different configuration can emerge, one that will not need to persuade you with longing. When desire returns, it will not feel like craving. It will feel like inevitability already quietly taking shape within. From this quiet absence of desire, another unsettling feature emerges. The future itself becomes opaque.
You might notice a persistent question circling your mind. What comes next?
Without any corresponding image, impulse, or intuition answering back. This is not because nothing is forming, but because the psyche does not reveal what is underway while the ego remains oriented toward what has already ended. Anticipation belongs to continuity. Prediction requires an existing identity to project itself forward. When that identity is dissolving, the psyche withholds preview. In Jungian terms, the unconscious reorganizes first below the threshold of representation. It does not narrate its work.
It completes it.
Consciousness learns only after the fact through the shock of recognition, rather than gradual explanation. This is why what follows feels sudden. Even though it has been prepared for quietly over time, the ego experiences the result, not the process. The blind spot is structural. The mind keeps reaching for clues, signals, or reassurance because it is accustomed to orienting itself through foresight. When none appears, anxiety creeps in, disguised as curiosity. The ego demands a map so it can maintain a sense of authorship over change. The shadow intensifies this demand, fearing surprise because surprise threatens control and exposes how little was actually being directed. But psychologically, invisibility is not a flaw in the process. It is its condition. What is coming cannot be imagined from the identity that is dissolving because imagination itself still borrows its materials from the old configuration. Any picture of the future formed now would be inaccurate, pulled backward into familiar shapes. The psyche protects reorganization by keeping it unthinkable until it stabilizes. This is why waiting feels empty rather than hopeful and why the question, "What's next?" echoes without reply. The silence is not neglect. It is containment. When the new orientation reaches coherence, it will not announce itself as a possibility. It will appear as something already in motion, already factual, already undeniable. The shock will not come from its intensity, but from how little warning it required. From this invisibility, the final phase emerges. Movement without preparation. What comes next does not arrive as a desire, a plan, or a surge of confidence. It enters as a fact. You may notice yourself acting before reflection forms, making decisions without internal debate, disengaging without the familiar need to explain. There is no excitement, no fear, no sense of risk. The ego expects transformation to feel dramatic, charged, or emotionally marked. Instead, it feels ordinary. This ordinariness is what makes it shocking. Jung observed that when psychic reorganization completes, behavior really nests automatically. The psyche does not ask for permission or reassurance. It moves once resistance has been removed. This is why the change feels sudden only in hindsight. There was no build-up because the work was not happening in consciousness. The unconscious stabilized first. Consciousness arrives late and calls it unexpected. The shock is not emotional. It is interpretive. The ego realizes it is no longer authoring the direction, only witnessing it.
Sadou tensión intensa faisgir.
The ego fears loss of control while the shadow fears exposure without narrative. Acting without motivation, justification, or visible struggle reveals how unnecessary force had become. Yet this phase is not reckless. It is precise. Action feels inevitable because it is no longer compensating for misalignment or chasing reassurance. It is expressing a structure that has already settled internally. You are not pushing forward. You are stepping into a position that was prepared quietly without urgency, without your supervision. This explains why rest came first. Rest was not recovery. It was the removal of interference.
Silence was not emptiness.
It was withdrawal from obsolete attachments. In Jungian terms, libido has already been reinvested elsewhere. What follows is not motivation returning or desire reigniting but coherence taking form. Life resumes movement without consulting your preferences. The shock is realizing nothing needed to be forced, repaired, or decided. The pause was not delay. It was completion. Begin by noticing where rest no longer feels like a choice you are making, but a condition you are inhabiting. Notice where effort no longer argues for itself. Where striving feels oddly irrelevant, not resisted, but unnecessary. There may be places in your life where you are no longer tempted to optimize, prepare, or rehearse outcomes, where anticipation has gone quiet without being replaced by anxiety. Stillness may feel factual rather than intentional, as if something in you has stopped asking for permission to stop. This is not collapse or withdrawal, but a subtle recognition that the inner demand has ended. When the psyche finishes its work, it does not announce completion through emotion or insight. It removes the question. Rest appears when the psyche has finished asking. You are not resting to prepare for what comes next. You are resting because what came before has completed its function. The psyche does not warn the ego before reorganizing. It simply withdraws energy and allows the old structure to fall silent. What follows feels shocking only because it does not negotiate with who you used to be. If this resonates, it is not because something dramatic is approaching, but because something decisive has already begun. This is Echoes of Psyche, where rest is not the pause before life resumes but the signal that your inner life has already moved on.